Configuring columns for editing and different editor input types in wpDataTables editor. Once we have an editable table, as we mentioned in the previous tutorial, we need to configure columns for editing. This includes basically choosing the proper editor input type. So this is the first thing that we're going to go through now. All the possible input types, how they are rendered, what are their differences, validation rules, etc. So once the table is configured as editable, you will see that each column block has an additional select box called editor input type. And here you can basically define the logic for front-end editing of this column. Let's go through all the input types. First one is none. Basically, when we enable the none editor input type, it means that there will be no editor input for this column. And when your front-end users edit the row or enter the new row, the default for this column will be used, or it won't be changed at all. So I've enabled the non-editor input type for the first name. Now let's reload the page and see how the editor looks here. See, so now we have only last name, birth date and age, though we have also the first name column here. And if we try to find to change something here, the last name is changed, but the first name remains intact. And if we add a new value, it will either be filled with default or with empty value if no default is provided. So this is pretty straightforward. Do you not always want to allow your users to edit all the columns? So if you don't want them to edit some of the columns, just set the non-editor input types for these. Next one is one-line edit. Basically, it's a very simple one-line text input, usually for short strings or numbers. If this is a float number, also number formatting, masking is applied to this editor input. But for strings, it's just a simple string, so it's one line. It doesn't support line breaks, and it has no specific validation rules. Next one is multi-line edit. The difference between one-line edit and multi-line edit apparently is that multi-line edits rendered not as a one-line input but as a memo or text area. It supports line breaks, and if we edit and enter several lines and save this, these line breaks will be preserved and also visible in the table front end. Rather than that, it's all the same, doesn't have any specific validation rules. It works just like one line input. Next editor input type is single value select box. Another one is a multi-value select box. These are similar. Basically, they allow your front-end user to choose one or several out of predefined values. The main thing to note here, if you want to use this input type, you would need to define the possible values in this input. So let's define red, green, blue, black, white, yellow. And the editor input type is set to single value select box. So save, reload the page. Try to edit, and you see that the first name editor input is rendered as a one-line select box, and you can choose one of the values that we just defined. For example, black, click OK, and the value black is saved for this row. Next one is the multi-line select box, multi-value select box. Basically it's the same, but if for single value select box your users are allowed to choose one and only one value per row, with Multiline Select Box, they're allowed to choose multiple or none. Okay, so let's choose the MultiValue Select Box here, save, refresh the table, and you see that the editor input gets a MultiValue Select Box here. So we can either choose none here or choose several values, click OK, and when they're saved, you see that these red, blue, yellow values are saved, comma separated. Next editor input type is the date. So I will revert this to one line edit. We already have the date input on the birth date field for this table. So if we reload and go to editing of one of the values, you see it shows like it's a one-line input, but once we click it, we get a date picker pop-up where we have the date, the year picker on the left, month picker here, or we can also switch months here, and we can set to today, reset the selection, or when we click the day, it's entering the date in the format that was specified in wpDataTables settings. And when we click OK, this date is saved, of course, for this row. Next editor input type is URL link. Basically, it's the same one-line edit. The main difference is that it has validation rule, and this validation rule is that the entered value should be a valid URL. Also, it can be empty if the column isn't defined to be non-empty. We will get to this later, but basically it must be a valid URL. So we made the first name input as URL link. Now we reload the page, click edit, and if we try to save, to apply, it will show us a validation error. It says, please provide a valid URL for the first name input, and it highlights it as a problematic one. So we need to add some valid URL, and then if we apply, it says the data saved successfully. Next one is email link, and it's also very similar. So if we choose the email link and reload the page, the editor for first name will check if the value entered is a valid email. So basically, again, it's a text input, but it will validate all the data entered to be proper email. And if we edit this and try to save now, it says please provide a valid email address for the field first name. So google.com is apparently not a valid email, but if I say test@google.com and then apply, it saves successfully since this is a valid email. Okay, so not much to mention also here. And the last one is the attachment editor input type. Attachment basically is it makes the front-end editor input to be a browse button, and when you click this browse button, you get the native WordPress media library where your users can upload or browse to previously uploaded files and attach them to the table rows. The main thing to notice here is that when you choose attachment as the editor input type, you must also choose the column type to be an URL link, so that users would be able to use this URL to download the attachment. So I've defined first name to be an attachment, and I'm reloading the page. So it became a URL link, but these are links to nothing actually. And now you see we get a browse button. When we click this browse button, we get our media library, and we can upload files, any files that our WordPress installation allows. So it can be documents, it can be some images or whatever. Let's, for example, click on this image and say that we want to use the selected file. So it shows us the file name here, and when we click OK, then this cell here becomes a link to the attachment that we just chose. The main limitation of the attachments is that since it uses native WordPress media library, it also derives the limitations of the media library, which are that users, to be able to upload, must have the file upload capability enabled. And by default, users are subscribers. They have the subscriber role, and this subscriber role doesn't have the file upload capability. You can go to our frequently asked questions page, and there we shown how you can enable the uploads for your users and even for logged out users. So even logged out users can be able to upload files, just that you need to make a small modification to your WordPress to allow that. But for me it makes sense to use the native WordPress logic and only make these tables editable and only make them allow uploads for the users that are permitted to do so. That's why we actually migrated from custom uploader to native WordPress uploader to be deeper integrated with the native WordPress logic. So next thing to mention is one more small checkbox here. So if we make it again one line edit and a string, sometimes some columns must contain a value, so your users can't leave them empty. And to do this also for front-end editing, we use this cannot be empty checkbox here. So when you tick this checkbox for an editable column and save, this column becomes mandatory. So it means that if your front-end user doesn't enter any value for this column, it will not allow to save. Now I'm reloading the page, and for example I want to add new value, but I enter only last name, date, and something here, and try to save. Maybe you notice that we get this star here, which in all web forms means that this value is mandatory. And when I try to save, it says first name field cannot be empty, and it highlights this field as a problematic one. So it will not allow me to click OK or apply till I enter something to this field, and only when I enter something and click OK, it will save. So basically that's it. You can play around with the editor with defining different settings for columns. In future and nearby future, we also plan to introduce MC editor input type. So for example, if there is a lot of values, a lot of text that you would like to enter here and also format it, it would be very handy. Right now it's not implemented, but watch our updates to see when we'll release it. And thanks for watching. See you in next tutorials.
wpDataTables, the easiest way to render interactive editable tables on your WordPress site. Purchase wpDataTables exclusively on Code Canyon.